Welcome to What Series 12, number 11. Let me just read this to you. It comes from Acts chapter 6 and verses 8 through to 15. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. Opposition arose, however, from the members of the synagogue of the Freemen, as it was called, the Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as from the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. These men began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom or the Spirit by whom he spoke. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses and against God." So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, "This fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs of Moses that had been handed down to us." All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. I've kind of titled this "How to Get Stoned," because that's what happened to Stephen in the end. You see, Stephen meets the criteria as a deacon and a servant, which we heard a little bit about last week. And it says here, reiterates that, "Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people." You see, he's full of grace and power. Last week we referred to him being full of the Spirit and wisdom. He has the Holy Spirit, he has wisdom, grace and power. Now that is a really good all-round set of ministry skills. But we've got to notice something. Persecution happens. Let's look at verse 9 again. Opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. These men began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom or the Spirit by whom he spoke. You see, some people are going to go to any length to discredit God and his people. Okay? That's bad enough. But listen where it goes. In verse 11, then they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses and against God." After that, what they did comes in verse 12. They stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law, and they seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified that this fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. They made it up. Even when that happens, when he's persecuted and lied about, Stephen's prepared to tell his story. And notice what happens, and this happens in chapter 7, he uses the story that the Jewish leaders identify with, and they know the history. He introduces his story in defense of saying, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham and was still in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran." You see, he tells the story to remind them how God works. And then he goes on and he explains it. And sometimes when the truth is spoken, people get really annoyed. Listen to what it says in a chapter further on. This is from Acts chapter 7 and verse 54. When they heard this, they were furious and they gnashed their teeth at him. So it's verbal disagreement and then physical disagreement in verse 57. At this they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they rushed at him. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. What's the whole thing with these leaders to do this? And And it's the church leaders, or it's the synagogue leaders. That's the Pharisees and Sadducees and all those guys. Verse 8, in chapter 8 of verse 1, it says, and Saul was there giving approval to his death. Wow, this is huge stuff. What a tragedy. People who said they knew God were criticizing those who obviously did know God. But how easy is that to do? If someone perceives God differently than what we think, we call them a heretic. And they should go off to another church or something like that. Let's be real here. None of us knows everything about God. We at first should listen, evaluate, and then discuss the issues. There are so many peripheral issues that we make primary. If a person doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, well, we have to question their theology seriously. But differing viewpoints on gifts and predestination, the second coming and creation, all those things are not essential for salvation. Let's discuss them and learn from each other, but love each other at the same time. If we don't, we are in danger of becoming like the leaders who killed off Stephen. Have a think about that this week.